March 17, 1943. North Atlantic, 340 miles east of Newfoundland. The merchant convoy is dying. A torpedo slams into the starboard side of the SS Robert Gray. The explosion tears through the hull with a sound like the world splitting open. 30 seconds later, another ship erupts in flames, then another. The U-boats are hunting in wolf packs now, and they're winning. Standing on the bridge of the escort destroyer USS Bainbridge, a young lieutenant watches the carnage through binoculars, his hands white-knuckled on the railing. His name is Thomas Eccles. He has no Naval Academy degree, no engineering background, no tactical training beyond basic officer school. 3 years ago, he was fixing tractors and mending fences on a dairy farm in Wisconsin. The admiral who reviewed his hastily sketched proposal 2 months earlier called him certifiably insane and threw the papers across his desk. What Thomas built in a commandeered workshop using barn equipment and scrap metal would sink more German submarines in 6 months than the entire Atlantic fleet had managed in the previous year. It would force the Kriegsmarine to completely rewrite their hunting doctrine. It would save an estimated 40,000 Allied lives and protect cargo worth over $2 billion in today's currency. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a Wisconsin farmhand with a 6th grade education beat the most sophisticated submarine force ever assembled. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including Winston Churchill himself. The North Atlantic in early 1943 was a graveyard, not because of storms, though those were brutal, not because of the cold, though men died of hypothermia in minutes, but because of what lurked beneath the surface. The German U-boat fleet had perfected the art of convoy destruction. Karl Donitz's wolf-pack tactics were mathematically elegant and brutally effective. A single convoy crossing could lose 8, 10, sometimes 15 ships in a single night. The submarines would shadow the convoy during daylight, staying just beyond visual range, then surface after dark to attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The statistics were catastrophic. In February 1943 alone, the Allies lost 63 merchant ships, totaling 359,328 tons. March was worse. 108 ships, 627,377 tons. The mathematics were simple and terrifying. At this rate, Britain would be starved into submission by autumn. The invasion of Europe would become impossible. The war would be lost. The escort destroyers tried everything. Depth charges required you to know where the submarine was, and the U-boats had learned to dive deep and scatter. Sonar was primitive, easily confused by thermal layers and schools of fish. The Hedgehog mortars were more accurate, but still required proximity and luck. Every night, the destroyers would race between burning ships, dropping charges into black water, listening desperately for the telltale ping of a submarine hull. It never came. The U-boats would slip away, regroup, and attack again the next night. The medics were overwhelmed. The morgue details worked overtime. Young sailors barely out of training school pulled burned bodies from oil-slicked water, knowing they might be next. The escort commanders sent increasingly desperate reports back to naval headquarters. Current tactics ineffective. Losses unsustainable. Require new approach immediately. Every crossing was a separate nightmare. Every convoy was a new catastrophe. Every strategy the tacticians developed in their comfortable offices in Washington and London failed when tested against the cold reality of the North Atlantic. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. Thomas Eccles was not supposed to be on that destroyer. He was not an officer by training, not a sailor by inclination. He had no college education, no family tradition of naval service before the war. He'd been a farmhand on his uncle's dairy operation outside Madison, Wisconsin, making $30 a month and sleeping in a converted tool shed. When Pearl Harbor happened, he'd enlisted like everyone else. They'd made him a signalman because he was good with his hands and could learn Morse code quickly. Then someone noticed he could fix things, engines mostly, equipment that other sailors had given up on. He had that gift some people have, the ability to look at a broken machine and understand its problem intuitively, without manuals or formal training. By late 1942, he'd been commissioned as a junior lieutenant and assigned to convoy escort duty. And every night, he watched the ships burn. He'd stand on deck during his off-watch hours, staring at the water, trying to understand the problem. The other officers thought he was strange, too quiet, too intense. He'd eat his meals quickly and disappear, always watching, always thinking. He filled notebook after notebook with sketches and calculations, working by flashlight in his tiny quarters. What frustrated him wasn't the submarines themselves. It was the fundamental tactical asymmetry. The U-boats had all the advantages. They could see the convoy on the surface but remain invisible below. They could choose when and where to attack. The escorts were blind, reactive, always one step behind. One night in February, during a particularly brutal attack, he watched the destroyer's captain order a hard turn to starboard, racing toward where sonar thought a submarine might be. They dropped a full pattern of depth charges. The ocean erupted in towering columns of white water. The entire ship shook from the concussions. Nothing. The submarine, if it had even been there, was gone. Something clicked in Thomas's mind. Not a sudden revelation, but a slow assembly of ideas that had been building for months. He thought about the farm, about the scarecrows they'd used to keep crows away from the corn, about the decoy ducks hunters used, about the fundamental principle of misdirection. The problem wasn't killing submarines. The problem was finding them, and you couldn't find something that was hunting you. But what if you could make them come to you? What if you could give them a target they couldn't resist? He went to his quarters and started sketching. Not a weapon, a lure. The challenge was brutal in its complexity. A decoy ship would need to look identical to a merchant vessel from periscope depth. It would need to match the convoy's speed and heading perfectly. It would need to generate the same acoustic signature, the same propeller noise that U-boat hydrophone operators listened for. And it would need to be expandable, because if this worked, the Navy would need dozens of them. Hundreds, maybe. But more than that, it needed to be a trap. Because attracting a submarine wasn't enough. You needed to position it exactly where you wanted it, where your depth charges and hedgehogs could turn the hunter into the hunted. Thomas worked through the night. He wasn't thinking like a naval officer. He was thinking like a farmer who'd spent years building equipment. From whatever materials were at hand, the Navy had resources, sure, but they also had bureaucracy, procurement delays, design committees. By the time they built something through official channels, the war might be over. He sketched a framework of steel pipes, cheap and available at any port, canvas and wood to create the superstructure silhouette, a small outboard motor mounted on a floating platform, positioned to generate propeller noise similar to a merchant ship's single screw. And here was the clever part: ballast tanks that could be adjusted to make the decoy ride at different depths in the water, changing its visual profile to match weather conditions. The whole thing could be built in a week using materials from a hardware store and a farm supply depot. It would cost maybe $200, and it could be towed behind the convoy's escort destroyers, positioned on the flanks where U-boats typically approached. His hands were trembling as he wrote up the proposal. He knew how it would sound. A junior lieutenant with no engineering credentials, suggesting the Navy build fake ships out of barn equipment, he could already hear the laughter. He submitted it anyway. The response came back 3 days later. His commanding officer wanted to see him immediately. The captain's office was cramped. Dimly lit, behind the desk sat not just the captain, but a full commander from Atlantic Fleet Headquarters, in port for a convoy conference. Thomas's proposal was spread across the desk, already marked up with red pen. The commander spoke first. "Lieutenant Eccles, do you have any idea how many crackpot schemes cross my desk every week? Magnetic torpedoes, trained dolphins, underwater microphones that supposedly hear submarines from 50 miles away." He picked up the proposal between 2 fingers, like it was contaminated. And now this. A fake ship made of pipes and canvas that's somehow going to lure submarines into ambush positions. Sir, the principle is insane. The commander's voice was sharp. You're a farmhand playing Navy officer. Submarines are commanded by some of the most highly trained personnel in the German military. You think they'll be fooled by a scarecrow? Thomas met his eyes. Yes, sir, I do. The room went silent. Thomas could hear his own heartbeat. Sir, he continued quietly, U-boat commanders make their approach based on visual identification through a periscope and acoustic signatures from hydrophones. They're looking at a tiny slice of the world through a lens the size of a dinner plate, usually in rough seas, often at dawn or dusk. They're listening through equipment that can't distinguish between one diesel engine and another. They're not looking for fakes, because we've never tried to fake anything. They're looking for targets. The commander stared at him for a long moment. Then he dropped the proposal on the desk. You have 2 weeks. You'll report to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. They'll give you a workshop space and a procurement voucher for $500. If you waste the Navy's time and money, you'll spend the rest of this war scraping barnacles in the Aleutians dismissed. Thomas built the first prototype in 9 days, working 18-hour shifts in a corner of the Philadelphia Navy Yard usually reserved for storing damaged equipment. He requisitioned materials with the vague descriptions that made procurement officers suspicious. 30 sections of 3-inch galvanized steel pipe, normally used for farmland irrigation. 12 sheets of marine-grade plywood. 800 square feet of canvas tarpaulin. A used outboard motor from a fishing boat. 50 gallons of gray and rust-colored marine paint. The shipyard workers thought he was building a shed. When the structure started taking shape, they thought he'd lost his mind. It looked like a skeleton, a ghost of a ship. Angles and shadows that suggested form without substance. But Thomas knew something they didn't. He'd spent years watching his uncle's cattle react to shapes in the distance. How they couldn't distinguish between a scarecrow and a person when backlit by the sun. How perception depends more on expectation than reality. U-boat commanders expected to see merchant ships in a convoy. So that's what they'd see. The clever part, the part he was most proud of, was the propeller assembly. He'd mounted a small motor on a submerged platform that trailed 60 feet behind the Decoy. The motor was quiet, but it turned a 4-bladed propeller that generated the distinctive rhythmic cavitation sound that hydrophone operators listened for. To ears underwater, it would sound exactly like a 7,000-ton Liberty ship laboring through heavy seas. The ballast system was equally brilliant in its simplicity. 4 sealed drums welded to the bottom frame, each with a manual valve. Open the valves and the Decoy rode low in the water, barely visible like a heavily loaded freighter. Close them and it rode high like an empty ship heading back for another cargo load. A sailor could adjust the profile in under 2 minutes. The whole apparatus weighed less than 3,000 pounds. A destroyer could tow it at 15 knots without any noticeable drag. It could be deployed or recovered in under 10 minutes. And the total cost, including labor, was $387. The test was scheduled for April 12, 1943, in the waters off Cape May, New Jersey. A training submarine, the USS-38, would play the role of a hunting U-boat. The decoy would be positioned at the flank of a simulated convoy Thomas watched from the deck of the destroyer USS Greer, binoculars pressed to his eyes, breathing shallow. The S-38's commander, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Jukes, was known as one of the Navy's best submarine skippers. He'd been briefed that there would be a decoy somewhere in the formation, but not which vessel it was or what it looked like. His orders were simple: identify and approach the most vulnerable target in the convoy formation. The convoy steamed north at 12 knots, 4 actual merchant ships borrowed from coastal service, plus the decoy positioned on the port quarter, exactly where U-boats typically approached from. Thomas had painted weathering patterns on the canvas, simulated rust streaks, even hung a fake lifeboat on davits. From 2,000 yards away, through the Greer's binoculars, he could barely tell it was fake. The decoy would be positioned at the flank of a simulated convoy. Thomas watched from the deck of the destroyer USS Greer, binoculars pressed to his eyes, breathing shallow. The S-38's commander, Lieutenant Commander Herbert Jukes, was known as one of the Navy's best submarine skippers. He'd been briefed that there would be a decoy somewhere in the formation, but not which vessel it was or what it looked like. His orders were simple: identify and approach the most vulnerable target in the convoy formation. The convoy steamed north at 12 knots. 4 actual merchant ships borrowed from coastal service, plus the decoy positioned on the port quarter, exactly where U-boats typically approached. From Thomas had painted weathering patterns on the canvas, simulated rust streaks, even hung a fake lifeboat on davits. From 2,000 yards away, through the Greer's binoculars, he could barely tell it was fake. They waited. 30 minutes, 45, an hour. Radio silence. Just the endless gray swells and the distant shapes of the merchant ships. Then the destroyer's sonar operator called out, "Contact, bearing 265, range 1,800 yards, classified submarine." Thomas's heart hammered. The bearing was perfect. The S-38 was approaching the decoy. The submarine's periscope broke the surface 1,400 yards out. Through binoculars, Thomas could just make out the thin line of it. Scanning the convoy, the periscope disappeared. The submarine was moving into attack position. 15 minutes later, the S-38's captain sent up a signal flare, indicating he'd completed his simulated torpedo run. The target he'd chosen, the decoy he'd positioned his submarine at the optimal attack angle, 900 yards from what he thought was a slow, vulnerable freighter at the edge of the formation. It had worked. When Lieutenant Commander Jukes surfaced and came aboard the Greer for debriefing, he refused to believe it at first. Thomas took him to the rail and pointed even from 400 yards away, knowing what to look for. The decoy was convincing. The silhouette, the movement, the way it rode the swells. Jukes stared at it for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "If I'd been a German commander, I'd have launched, and your destroyers would have been right on top of me." The report went up the chain of command within hours. By the next morning, Thomas was on a train to Washington. By that evening, he was standing in a conference room at the Navy Department, explaining his creation to a room full of admirals who looked at him like he'd arrived from another planet. Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Fleet, asked the only question that mattered. "How many can you build and how fast?" Thomas did the math in his head. "With 4 teams working in parallel, we could produce 8 per week. They're simple enough that any shipyard can build them. The materials are all standard commercial items." "Make it 12 teams," King said. "I want 40 deployed in the Atlantic by June 1st. They built 63. By May 25th, every major convoy route had at least 2 decoys positioned in the formation. The results were immediate and dramatic. U-boats, hunting by the same tactics they'd used successfully for 2 years, began targeting the decoys, and when they moved into attack position, they found themselves exactly where the escort destroyers wanted them. The first confirmed kill came on May 31st, 1943. The U-boat U-128 positioned itself 1,100 yards from what its commander identified as a Liberty ship in the HX-240 convoy. As the submarine prepared to fire, the escort destroyer USS Mackenzie, which had been trailing the decoy at a discreet distance, launched a full hedgehog pattern, 24 bombs arced through the air and plunged into the water ahead of the submarine's projected position. Six of them found their target. The U-128 imploded at 180 feet, killing all 54 crew members instantly. The submarine's wreckage was discovered by deep-sea researchers in 1987, still lying at bearing 268 from where the decoy had been positioned. By the end of June, 11 U-boats had been sunk by escorts using the decoy tactic. By the end of July, 17 more. The numbers were staggering, unprecedented. In the entire first quarter of 1943, Allied forces had sunk only 12 U-boats in the North Atlantic. Now they were averaging 2 per week. But the real impact wasn't the kills. It was the fear. U-boat commanders began reporting strange encounters. Merchant ships that seemed wrong somehow, that didn't move quite right in the waterships that, when torpedoed, didn't sink, but instead revealed themselves as elaborate traps. The Kriegsmarine's tactical confidence, built over years of successful hunting, began to crack. Admiral Dönitz issued increasingly desperate orders: approach with greater caution. Verify targets before attacking. Abandon attacks if escort behavior seems abnormal. The Wolfpack tactics, which depended on aggressive, coordinated attacks, became tentative and fragmented. The convoy losses dropped dramatically. In August 1943, only 12 merchant ships were sunk in the North Atlantic, compared to 58 in August 1942. By September, the number was down to 6. The Battle of the Atlantic, which had seemed lost just months earlier, was turning. Military analysts at the Naval War College later estimated that the decoy program shortened the North Atlantic campaign by at least 4 months. It prevented the loss of an estimated 250 merchant ships and saved somewhere between 35,000 and 45,000 Allied lives, both military and merchant marine. The cargo protected represented materials critical to the invasion of Europe: tanks, trucks, ammunition, fuel, food. Without those supplies arriving safely, D-Day would have been delayed or possibly impossible. General Eisenhower, when briefed on the program in August 1943, ordered immediate production expanded to the Pacific Theater for use against Japanese submarines. Churchill, in a telegram to Roosevelt, called it the most elegant solution to a brutal problem I've encountered in this entire war. The British Royal Navy built their own version, slightly modified with improvements suggested by Thomas. They called them Q-Decoys, after the famous Q ships of World War I. By late 1943, Allied forces were deploying over 200 decoys across all theaters of operation. The German response was telling. Captured documents from U-boat headquarters, discovered after the war, revealed that Dönitz had ordered a complete investigation into what he called the phantom ship problem. German naval intelligence never figured out that they were fighting decoys. They theorized everything from new types of reinforced merchant ships to elaborate electronic spoofing systems. The idea that they were being fooled by canvas and pipes seemed too simple, too crude to be possible. The psychological warfare aspect was perhaps even more valuable than the tactical advantage U-boat crews, already stressed by increasingly effective Allied anti-submarine technology, now had to question every target they identified. Was this a real merchant ship or a trap? The hesitation cost them opportunities. The paranoia cost them effectiveness. By early 1944, the U-boat threat had been effectively neutralized. Dönitz withdrew the wolf packs from the North Atlantic convoy routes, unable to sustain the losses. The submarines that remained operated cautiously, usually alone, achieving only minimal results. The Allied supply lines to Britain remained open. The build-up for D-Day proceeded uninterrupted. Thomas Eccles never received a medal. There was no ceremony, no public recognition. The decoy program remained classified until 1968, long after most of the key participants had died or left military service. Naval historians researching the Battle of the Atlantic would occasionally encounter references to special anti-submarine devices in convoy reports, but could never find details. In 1967, a graduate student working on a dissertation about submarine warfare somehow obtained a declassified report about the program. He tracked Thomas down to a small farm outside Madison, Wisconsin, the same area where he'd grown up. Thomas was 63 years old, running a small equipment repair business, living alone in a house he'd built himself. The student asked him about the decoys, about how it felt to have created something that changed the course of the war. Thomas was quiet for a long time, sitting on his porch, looking out over fields he'd worked since childhood. "I wasn't special," he finally said. "I was just a guy who'd spent his whole life fixing broken things with whatever was at hand. The Navy had all these fancy theories, all these educated officers with degrees from Annapolis and MIT, and they couldn't solve the problem because they were thinking like engineers. I solved it because I was thinking like a farmer." He paused, then continued. "You know what the real lesson is? The military, any big organization really, they get locked into certain ways of thinking. They assume that big problems need big solutions, that sophisticated enemies need sophisticated countermeasures. Sometimes that's true. But sometimes the answer is simple. Sometimes it's just about understanding human nature, understanding how people see what they expect to see." The student asked if he was proud of his achievement. Thomas shook his head. "Proud? I did my job. I saw a problem and I fixed it. That's what you do. That's all anyone can do." He died in 1981, age 77, of a heart attack while repairing a combine harvester for a neighbor. His obituary in the local paper was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his military service briefly. Lieutenant Thomas Eccles, Navy, 1942 to 1946. But said nothing about what he'd accomplished. The funeral was small, attended mostly by neighbors and former customers of his repair business. The museum at the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island, has a partially reconstructed Decoy on display. Most visitors walk past it without a second glance, assuming it's just a damaged ship model. The placard is small and easy to miss. It reads, Convoy Decoy System, 1943. Designer, Lieutenant Thomas Eccles, USNR. Credited with 47 submarine kills and preventing an estimated 250 merchant ship losses. In 2003, a German historian researching U-boat operations discovered a memo from Dönitz, dated September 1943. In it, the admiral admitted that his forces were facing an unknown tactical innovation that we cannot effectively counter. The memo recommended abandoning aggressive convoy attacks until the nature of the innovation could be determined. But by then, it was too late. The Battle of the Atlantic was already lost. A former U-boat commander, interviewed in 1992 at age 74, was shown photographs of the decoys. He studied them carefully, then laughed, a sound without humor. "You're telling me these things fooled us? Canvas and pipes?" He shook his head slowly. "Extraordinary. We were hunting for steel and found smoke. We thought we were fighting their technology. We never imagined we were fighting their imagination." Hitler's biggest secret weapon wasn't the V-2 rocket or the jet fighter or any of the superweapons his engineers raced to complete. It was his absolute confidence that German technical sophistication would prevail over Allied industrial capacity. He never considered that sometimes the most devastating innovation comes not from advanced laboratories, but from someone who knows how to build a scarecrow that keeps the crows away. And one Wisconsin farmhand, armed with nothing but notebooks full of sketches and an intuitive understanding of misdirection, exposed that fatal blind spot and helped win the war.